Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be doing a book review of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what everyone needs to know. Obviously I read this as a result of what's going on between Hamas and Israel currently. In this video we are going to first review or summarize a big chunk of the book, probably going to be going into that a little bit more than we normally do on these book reviews. Then I'm going to talk about some of the details of why I read the book and well as my impressions, and then we're going to justify the ratings that we have here, and let's get into it. In the first chapter, titled The Basics, they cover the two groups, Palestinians and Israelis, and describe what they are and what they aren't. They cover that, the distinction between Palestinians and Arabs. They talk about, nationalism, and that is a pan-Arabian sort of sentiment, which a lot of people who supported the Palestinian movement initially supported a pan-Arabian, which is a unified Arabian movement, and then later, switched to supporting a Palestinian movement when it seemed to be the case that Israel was there to stay. On the Israeli front, it's important to make distinctions because Israeli is a nationality, and then Jew is a, both religious and ethnic group. So Jew refers to both people who are descended from Jews, regardless of their religion, as well as people who are religiously Jewish. And so this is an important distinction to make because you can have secular Jews, of which, the Zionist movement to initially begin to, settle the lands of Israel again, or at the time Palestinian mandate under the United Kingdom. That was largely secular initially. And also, Israeli is important to distinguish. It's a nationality because there are a lot of ethnic Palestinians or people who identify as Palestinian. Roughly 20% of the Israeli population is Palestinian, and this is a recurring kind of important thing to note because, the Israeli, generally speaking, what the Israeli government wants to do is they want to maintain be democratic and also be Jewish, and in order to do so, they need to be predominantly Jewish in terms of their population. Something I found very interesting, and the author goes out of their way to point out, is that the movements, both the Palestinian movement and the Israeli movement, started out primarily actually being secular and not religious, and it's only later that the religious element was introduced. They are by and large nationalist movements, not religious movements, and they also point out, for hundreds of years, members of the Abrahamic religions were able to live in, Muslim lands peacefully, with limited discrimination relative to other religions because they viewed the Abrahamic religions as being kind of a step above, and this is kind of important to note because it's not this long-standing, religious feud as it is often painted today. Contrary to popular belief, which states that this is kind of, a conflict that has been going on a really long time, it started roughly 150 years ago in 1881 with the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, pictured on the left. Following the assassination, the Jews were blamed for the assassination of the Tsar, and eventually this led to an exodus of around 2.5 million Jews from Russia. 3% of those Jews eventually immigrated to Palestine and kind of, founded the initial or expanded what settlements were there, looking for a place and also trying to get away from persecution in Russia. To give an idea of the progression of the number of Jews living in Palestine, we're going to defer to the book, which has the numbers. In 1882, Jews accounted for no more than 8% of the population of Ottoman Palestine. By 1922, with the establishment of the British Mandate for Palestine, Jews constituted 11% of the population. By 1931, they had increased to 17%, and just 5 years later, in 1936, this figure had jumped to 28%. By 1946, Jews made up 30% of the country's population. Over this entire period, 1882 to 1946, the total number of Jews living in Palestine skyrocketed from 24,000 to 543,000, mostly due to immigration. This single fact explains the origins of the conflict better than any ancient history. Theodor Herzl was the father of modern Zionism, and he's pictured on the right. We are going to give a definition from the book for Zionism. Zionism can be defined as a type or subset of Jewish nationalism, based upon four fundamental claims. 1. Jews are a nation. 2. All nations have a right to national self-determination, i.e. to govern themselves. 3. Jews should exercise their right to national self-determination in the land of Israel, their national homeland. And 4. To achieve this, this, Jews in the diaspora, or in the exile in classic Zionist terminology, should return en masse to the land of Israel, and this is called the ingathering of the exiles. Now, Zionism was not popular amongst European Jews until after the Holocaust, at which point, the idea of having a place from which they could, defend themselves and govern themselves became much more attractive. Now, Haj Amin Al Husseini, hopefully I pronounced that right, pictured on the left, was kind of the premier figure in terms of the Arab leaders in Palestine during this time, or during these early years. He led a revolt against the Ottoman Empire, and eventually, the land that was in the Ottoman Empire of the Palestinian land went over to the United Kingdom. Al-Husseini was first and foremost kind of an Arab pan-nationalist, but eventually he kind of switched towards this more Palestinian nationalism, which had many of the same sort of features that the Jewish Zionism has, in that they want self-determination, self-governance, and particularly they want it in the same area. So the particulars of the land and the nationalism is largely a better, seen as a better indication of the cause rather than religious causes. Now, there are two things of particular note with al-Husseini's in regards to his legacy, and that is, one, he supported the fascist regime during World War II, which largely can explain why he might have gotten less support later on from the UK, who had declared the Balfour Declaration, earlier in the century, in which they guaranteed the land to Israel. But notably, he rejected, when the UK was leaving in 1946, he rejected the UN Partition Plan, partitioning between Israel and Palestine, and this could be widely regarded as, one of the central causes, because had such an agreement been accepted, perhaps the conflict never would have erupted, and we would instead have two states. Although both, kind of laying claim to similar territory, it probably would have still led to a conflict eventually, but al-Husseini's rejection of the UN proposal was a little bit of a powder keg sparker. On the left, you can see what the UN Partition Plan was, that the Zionist leadership accepted and the Palestinian leadership rejected. Eventually, this rejection turned into protest, and then eventually the protest turned into violence, and eventually there was effectively a civil war between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and this was a civil war that they won. Just a few months later, in what Israel refers to as their War of Independence, and the Palestinians have another word for it, it's an Arabic word, I believe the translation's roughly catastrophe. Following this, the Arab League states, which comprised of several countries surrounding Israel, attacked Israel. Now, this is often portrayed as being a religious conflict, but the book disagrees with this assertion, arguing that it was more to do with political expediency and territorial aims, and just to quote from the book here, thus when the Arab League members, primarily Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, went to war with the newly declared State of Israel on May 15th, 1948, it was their own national interests defined by their autocratic rulers that motivated them first and foremost, although there was a secondary motivation in the religious one, but it was not anywhere near like the primary motivation to annihilate them from the map. And another portion, they say, contrary to the popular Israeli narrative, the Palestinians and the Arab states were not all intent on preventing the emergence of a Jewish state. Now, even though the United States and the USSR had recognized Israel before this invasion, the day before the invasion, if this invasion was successful, Israel would no doubtably have been wiped off the map. However, they succeeded in defending against the Arab League, and thus kind of won what is a complete independence, in this back-to-back war, first a revolutionary war, and then, the war against the Arab League. However, once they did this, they did occupy the lands that were part of the UN Partition Plan we see here. To quote the book, having allotted 56% of British Mandatory Palestine in 1947, the United Nations Partition Resolution, Israel managed to retain this land and conquer some additional territory that had been allocated to the proposed Arab state. As a result, Israel's territory now comprised of about 78% of Mandatory Palestine. Now, this is going to be talked about greatly later in the book, in the 5th chapter, which is titled something to the effect of occupation, but this is notably considered occupied territory, even though Israel did not take it from another state. It was, formerly the UK. The UK abandoned it. Mandatory Palestine, they left, and there was no state, just a proposed Arab state, but under international law, this is still considered occupied territory. Now, the Palestinian refugee issue emerged out of this war as well, and this is considered one of the main issues that is difficult to resolve in any sort of peace negotiations. Some 600 to 700,000 Palestinians were evicted from their homes, and they remain in diaspora today, along with their descendants. Some of them, they later note in the book, carrying the keys to the homes that they had left abandoned. And now there's largely a disagreement. Israel largely blames Palestinian leadership for telling these Palestinians to evacuate their home, and also blames them for not accepting the initial UN Partition Plan. However, Palestinians, understandably, blame Israel for this, eviction. And the book largely looking at some of the background research, has this. Morris's research showed us that the Palestinians did not generally leave because they were encouraged or ordered to do so by Palestinian or Arab leaders, except notably in the case of Palestinian inhabitants of the city of Haifa, as generations of Israelis have been told. Many Palestinians were in fact violently expelled by Zionist and Israeli troops, just as Palestinian narrative maintains. Now, pictured on the left, you can see both the partition plan as well as Israel's borders following these two wars. On the right is Egypt's president at the time, Nasser, who was attacked by coalition force of Israel, the United Kingdom, and France in what Israel kind of describes as a preemptive war. This was largely due to various provocations, including shutting down a strait through which commerce went into Israel, effectively cutting off supplies. This was largely condemned. It was met with widespread international condemnation, including Eisenhower administration of the United States, which was worried the attack on Egypt would drive the Arab world and possibly the rest of the developed world into the arms of the Soviet Union. And the main purpose of this was some good old-fashioned imperialism, largely control over the Suez Canal. Now, although Egypt's military forces did poorly in this war, there was large international pressure, particularly from the US, and this led to the withdrawal of the United Kingdom and France's forces, effectively ending their imperialism there, as well as, eventually the withdrawal of the Israeli forces once they had secured, the trade through the Straits of Tiran. The book notes that Nasser's soaring popularity in the wake of the Sinai War became like a cult of personality and made Nasserism the most potent political force in the Arab world. The ideology preached pan-Arabianism, Arabian socialism, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and anti-Zionism, calling for the removal of Western influence from the Middle East, the replacement of reactionary Arab regimes, and the liberation of Palestine. Now, notably, this is a kind of move in the direction of a pan-Arabianism under Nasser. If you're kind of tracking the idea of both, Palestinian nationalism and pan-Arabianism, this was particularly popular at this point in time following the Sinai War in, I believe it was 57. The next war, of which Nasser also played a part, was the 1967 war, which was a bit of a strange one as far as the start went. The Soviet Union leaked false reports that Egypt was massing its borders on Israel's border, and then Egypt, in a weird sort of diplo power play that was characteristic of the boldness of Nasser, actually mobilized their forces and put them on Israel's borders. Israel, of course, responded in kind, mobilizing their force and putting it on their own borders, which of course is very expensive and is not something that can be maintained long term. Following this, Nasser also signed a defensive pact with Jordan in the east and Syria in the north, kind of effectively surrounding Israel. And following all of this, Israel attacks the forces of Nasser and defeats them quite soundly. This kind of brings about the end of this Nasserism, as well as, a shift towards more Palestinian nationalism. To quote the book, in the years that followed the war, Nasserism lost much of its popular appeal and the political influence in the Arab world, especially in Egypt. This was a resounding failure for Egypt here and Nasser. The war was notably a short war, and in this, Israel conquered both the Gaza Strip as well as the Sinai Peninsula, pictured here in the image. Now, this didn't last for too long. In 1973, Egypt attacked Israel again in what was a very bold claim, because following, the war in 67, it was very clear that Israel's military was way stronger, and so it seemed like a bad idea to attack them, but, it was called the Yam Kippur Kippur War in 1973 because they attacked during the Jewish holiday. Israel was completely unprepared, and while, they were roughly saying winning the fight, they suffered massive casualties, unlike what they had in previous wars, and this was largely regarded as like a calamity for them, and eventually this brought about the sort of policy of land for peace. In order to get peace with Egypt, Israel returned Sinai, but not the Gaza Strip. And this was kind of the first instance of an Arab country, making peace with Israel. It was not without any sort of, downsides, however. Now, without going into too much detail on the peace treaty that was negotiated over several years, Sadat actually did get the Nobel Peace Prize as a result of negotiating this peace treaty. He was both the invader of Israel at this time and also negotiated the peace treaty. He is pictured above. However, he was assassinated, which this was the consequence I was referring to. He was assassinated by Islamic extremists. I believe that they were part of Hamas, or what would eventually become Hamas, and this is notably one of the reasons why Egypt today, contemporarily, is a little bit leery about letting, Palestinians into its territory, as it has had a previous leader assassinated by Islamic extremists, and so this is a notable one. But Egypt kind of since then has had a relatively, and I mean relatively, good relationship with Israel in the context of the Middle East. Now, that's Egypt. Going back to focus on what happened in 1967, when Israel beat the Arab League states, this was the decline of, again, Nasserism and the rise of Palestinian nationalism, which the book notes the 1967 war changed this. The defeat of the Arab states and failure of their would-be savior, Nasser, shocked Palestinians and convinced them that they could no longer rely on the Arab states for their own deliverance, and thus they had to take matters into their own hand. Later, in another paragraph, inspired by the Algerian War of Independence against France and by other successful anti-colonial liberation movements, such as those conducted by the Vietnamese, these groups adopted a strategy of armed struggle, including the use of guerrilla warfare and terrorism. So this led to the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. This notably staged attacks in West Bank, in Gaza, and also out of Jordan, where they were located. They had a bunch of conflicts with Jordan. It's a bit too much to unpack, but following their ejection from Jordan, they relocated into Lebanon in the north. So in 1982, Israel attacked Lebanon, and this was a very controversial war, or it was one of its more controversial wars. The war was approved by cabinet, but not the full extent of the war was known, even by the cabinet that approved it. According to the book, the real intentions behind Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon were far more ambitious than the limited objective approved by the Israeli cabinet and supported by Israeli public opinion. Later, larger and longer military offensive that would penetrate far deeper into Lebanon. The objective was not merely to remove the PLO from southern Lebanon, but to completely eradicate its presence in Lebanon as a whole. So what went from, a very short operation went into one that was penetrating entirely deep into Lebanon. Later, it was in Israeli parlance a war of choice, whereas the wars of 1948, 67, and 73 were all regarded by almost all Israelis as wars of no choice, and hence fundamentally just wars. Later, for the first time in the country's wartime history, there was widespread public protest against the Lebanon War. Now, this war was a little bit complex with multiple participants, but Israel eventually, is successful, and there are also, international peacekeeping forces, and one of the more striking and disturbing passages relating to Israel's military's conduct in here is in regard to this war, and I'm going to read it here. Within days of the peacekeeping force's departure, this is the International Peacekeeping Force, which was American, French, and Italian. Within days of the peacekeeping force's departure, however, the worst atrocity of the Lebanon War occurred after the Israeli army entered West Beirut, violating the U.S. brokered truce, and allowed their Lebanese Christian ally into the Palestinian and refugee camps to root out any remaining PLO fighters. Instead, the Falangist militiamen brutally took their revenge for the assassination of their leader, Bashir Gemayel, who had been recently killed in a bombing 2 days earlier after having just recently been elected the president of Lebanon. Systematically moving from house to house, they murdered, mutilated, and I can't say that word on YouTube, unarmed Palestinians. So these are not PLO fighters, but they are unarmed Palestinian, part of the diaspora, the original 700,000 that has become like around 2 million that were evicted from their homes in 47, or was it 48? I think it was 47. And so this is, in my mind, like one of the particularly bad ones. The rampage went on for 3 days, September 17th through 19th, 1982, while Israeli soldiers stood outside the camps, almost certainly aware of what was happening, but not intervening to stop it until they were finally ordered to do so. Later, estimates of the number of Palestinians killed ranged from 800 to as many as 2,750, mostly women, children, and old men. So, now this brings us to chapter 4, which is the peace process. Now the first major one is the Camp David Accords, which we discussed a little bit when talking about Egypt, but just a reminder, that is when Egypt kind of recognized and made a kind of lasting peace with Israel, which really sets the stage for any sort of future peace process. The PLO, who had been rooted out of Lebanon, fled and went to Tunisia, which is notably in northern Africa and is quite a bit far from Israel, so now they're far from the Gaza Strip, and they are far from the West Bank. And so this eventually kind of puts them under significant pressure because there's a massive protest, the Intifada, I believe it's called. There was the first one of these, which was, large protests on the parts of Palestinians, very significant violence and terrorism, and this is now putting the PLO in a bad spot because the PLO is at risk of losing their representation of leadership of the Palestinians at this point, and the PLO is led by Yasser Arafat, pictured here on the right. They are at risk of losing leadership here, and so they're in a bit of a desperation play, and so they reach out and make contact with Israel through the intermediary in Norway, in what's known as the Oslo Accords, or the beginning of this peace process discussion, which is kind of made possible by Yasser Arafat's desperation and wanting to stay in charge of the Palestinian cause. And by doing this and gaining international recognition as a negotiator, he kind of cements himself as, being in charge of the Palestinian movement, which before now has had no sort of international recognition or like legitimization. The official stance has been one of violence and terrorism, similar to how Algeria got their independence, and now I believe it's in 91 when the peace talks start beginning here for Oslo. Pictured on the left is the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, and it sounds like that this picture, which is a famous picture, was taken on September 13th, 1993, as part of these Oslo Accords, or kind of the finalization of the talks that had begun earlier. What they agreed upon was a sort of interesting thing where they would have this slow rollout of concessions by both sides. There was the foundation of the PA, or the Palestinian Authority, which would have, jurisdiction for some, administrative services in both the West Bank as well as in the Gaza Strip. And also, here is a bit of concession. In these letters, the PLO renounced the use of terrorism and explicitly recognized the right of the State of Israel to exist in peace and security, while Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people and its official negotiating partner. This sort of hardline approach that the PLO had previously had, again, they kind of deviate from this in order to ensure that they can still maintain power, and there is some security assurances for Israel, along with the idea that the PA, or the Palestinian Authority, will slowly gain more and more control, and there will be more concessions kind of on both sides as both sides demonstrate good faith. However, they don't really demonstrate that good of faith, and the peace process begins to unravel, or rather, perhaps not unravel, but not make progress. Now, eventually the peace process was kind of full stopped when on the left, Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated, not by any Palestinians, but instead, more of the hardliners from, more of a Jewish hardliner, one of these religious extremists, Zionists. He was assassinated for kind of accepting the idea of a two-state solution, because this notably, all of the land in the West Bank, in terms of the religious Zionists, they believe that this is the land of Israel, in biblical times, and as such cannot be parted with entirely. And I think that this is a point that they make later in the book, but I think it's worth pointing out now. Both sides, and by sides I mean Palestinians and people of Israel, the Jews, both of these sides have very, very large chunks of population, double-digit percentages, who just don't want any sort of compromise. And this is one that makes any sort of potential peace process extraordinarily difficult. Following the death or the assassination rather, of Rabin, here we have Arafat. When Arafat, for instance, this is the man on the right, was informed of Rabin's assassination, he is reported to have responded, "Today the peace process has died." Since Rabin, there has not been any really Israeli prime minister that has been particularly interested in a two-state solution peace process that involves, giving concessions of lands of the West Bank to the Palestinians. And so here we have kind of a stalling out, as it were. Now, the book does a good job of outlining kind of what are the major sticking points in the peace process, and I think they're worth noting here, although they are, of course, gone over in much greater detail. Number one, the future of contested city of Jerusalem. Notably, Palestinians want to have their capital in Jerusalem. Israel wants to have their capital in Jerusalem. This is a bit of a problem. Currently, Israel occupies all of Jerusalem, and you could have a sort of solution that has, either an international organization having control of Jerusalem, or, East and West Jerusalem, which is many of the two-state solutions feature East and West Jerusalem. We have number two, the fate of the Palestinian refugees. This is a bit of a sticky one because, notably, Israel does not want to allow Palestinian refugees to return to Israel specifically, as a result of them wanting to be both democratic and Jewish. And of course, if you incorporate a large portion population that is not Jewish, and you still remain democratic, you will stop being Jewish, right? And so this is one of the reasons why they do not want to allow them to return. But also, kind of going back to the initial argument, they put the blame on the Palestinians themselves for leaving, and the Palestinians for not accepting the UN Partition Plan. So they do not consider this to be an issue that they have to resolve, and they have to let, what is now several generations later, like some 2 million Palestinians, they do not think that this is something that they need to do, although most kind of negotiations and concessions involve some amount of return, but this is just like family members and something like 50,000 as the cap, not the full shebang, not the full 2 million. Number three, the borders of a future Palestinian state. This notably involves the return of the West Bank. And one of the more creative solutions that both sides agree to in principle, although the exact details need to be negotiated out, is that Palestine would get almost all of the West Bank. There is, of course, the problem of Israeli settlers in Palestine, and what they instead would do is a land swap, and Israeli settlers in the West Bank, and most of the Israeli settlers are on just the very border, and they are there because it is much cheaper to get rent inside of the Gaza, not Gaza Strip, inside of the West Bank. However, there's a lot of more extremist settlers who are settling just kind of in the very middle of the West Bank, or really deep into the West Bank, often intentionally in disruptive areas to make any sort of peace partition or difficult, just making everything... because the entire thing is, if you settle a huge settlement in the middle, how will you make a contiguous landmass? And you can't do it without drawing some very weird shapes. But the idea is that Israel would get the West Bank that is very heavily occupied, and then they would trade other Israeli land in exchange for that, such that there would be, roughly speaking, something that is a bit more equitable. So this is one I thought was worth mentioning. And four, the security arrangements between Israel and a Palestinian state. Notably, essentially, a lot of what Israel looks for is defense in depth, and one of the arguments that they make that they need is to have buffers, for their neighbors, which is not without any sort of merit because they have been attacked repeatedly, and so it is understandable that they would want a little bit of depth. Israel is a very small country, and it's also very thin, so this means that you will not have a large amount of warning or this sort of stuff in terms of strategic defense, and so these are the four big considerations that we have. So as a bit of a bridge between chapters 4 and 5, we're going to talk about the Second Intifada. We're not going to go into too much depth on it, but it was a bloody cycle of escalating Palestinian and Israeli violence that continued for 4 years until 2005, in which 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians were killed. Now, the Israeli groups tended to blame Yasser Arafat for failing to prevent violent terrorism, and the Palestinians tended to blame the Israelis, arguing that the portion of the Oslo Accords, it was not in good faith. They were not maintaining their kind of position. To kind of quote some of the book here, the number of Israeli settlers increased by around 70% from 115,000 to 200,000 during the years of the Oslo peace process, which, remember, is not an especially long period of time. Palestinians saw the continued growth of Israeli settlements and the settler population as incontrovertible evidence that Israel had no intention of ever withdrawing from Palestinian territory. The Palestinians also highlight Israel's failure to fulfill commitments that it made, such as opening the safe passage between West Bank and Gaza. And so we have this massive and violent protest that occurs, and it eventually leads in the construction of a massive wall, which gets covered in the next or second or fifth chapter, rather, which is about the Israeli occupation. So chapter 5 starts off with a definition of occupation and argues that Israel is definitely an occupier in terms of the international definition of occupation. It then goes on to talk about how there is inequity in terms of the treatment of Palestinians and Israelis, and there's effectively an apartheid state. Now, part of this is the construction of an enormous wall/fence that separates, various parts of the West Bank, and this was built largely in response to the Second Intifada, and it was also largely very successful at reducing violence, although Palestinians or opponents of Israel generally argue that this decrease in violence would have happened anyways, and so confounding variables, but following the construction of this massive structure, violence did decrease. Now, in order to get through it, it's a huge amount of checkpoints, and they only really apply to Palestinians. So there's discrepancies in freedom of movement. The Palestinians obviously can't vote, and there's even a separate legal system for the Palestinians who are under military jurisdiction in terms of military courts, while Israelis living in this very same West Bank are subject to different rules. There is a high degree of tolerance from the settlers that are settled deep inside the Gaza Strip for violence against Palestinians, and the Israeli defense with the IDF doesn't do a whole lot. Notably, also, this chapter talks about how the IDF is represented in terms of an increasingly large percentage of the IDF is also the religious settlers who are settled in, deep into the West Bank, or these types of people are overrepresented in the IDF, and so this creates a little bit of problems if you're thinking more big picture. Any sort of full leaving of the West Bank has the potential for a military coup attempt if there's sufficient people in the military are not a fan of this sort of thing. And so we have this apartheid system. It goes into great depth on it. I'm not going to talk about it too much. Instead, we're mostly going to talk about Gaza and Hamas. So as part of addressing the Second Intifada, and also as a result of international sort of pressure that was brought, a lot of international attention is brought by the Second Intifada, and so in order to combat this pressure, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who is pictured here, has a somewhat innovative solution, which is withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. Now, this strategy is a little bit weird, but he still believed that peace talks with the Palestinians were pointless. He had notably accepted a two-state solution, but to continue the quote, and frequently asserted that Israel had no Palestinian partner with whom to negotiate. To avoid being forced into negotiations and possibly pressured to make concessions he strongly opposed, he seized the initiative. And what he did is he withdrew from the Gaza Strip. Now, this did a few things. It's notably, it allows him to get the international community off his back because he is, withdrawing from the Gaza Strip. And to quote, I believe this is him, or no, this is his chief of staff, Dov Weissglass, the disengagement plan makes it possible for Israel to part conveniently in an interim situation that distances us as far as possible from political pressure. It legitimizes our contention that there is no negotiating with Palestinians because they have made a concession and they haven't received anything. There is a decision here to do the minimum possible in order to maintain our political situation. Also, secondary to this concern was that he did not want a bunch of Palestinians living in Israel. And so, if you integrate the Gaza Strip and you end up giving citizenship to the Palestinians, then they're going to vote to, quote, significantly reduce the number of Palestinians living under Israeli control and thereby help safeguard Israel's long-term future as a Jewish and democratic state. This is notable because you cannot, if you're democratic and you're not giving people the ability to vote, you're not really democratic. And then if you're Jewish, except for a majority of your population is Palestinian, you're not really Jewish. And so this was a secondary part of it. And also what was potentially possible for Sharon that was a bit intriguing was he might have withdrawn from, the West Bank as well. However, he has a stroke and he dies, unfortunately. So this withdrawal from the Gaza Strip was widely regarded, in the post-hoc analysis as a bit of a disaster. Now, the book makes an interesting argument that part of why it was so bad was the result of complete disengagement that was unilateral and was not negotiated with another partner. But what ended up happening is this leads to the rise of Hamas, not just because, there's a power vacuum, but also because, the Palestinian group that was popular at the time, by not having negotiated with Israel, they kind of just look feckless. And so, it doesn't look like a victory for them. And instead, this other group comes about and we get Hamas, which is, of course, the Islamic terrorist organization that is more violent than the other Palestinian organization that was in place at the time. And they supplant them. And this, of course, creates a situation where it's understandable that Israel does not want to withdraw from the West Bank now, because the West Bank is very close to its population centers, and the West Bank also, if you had Hamas take over in the West Bank as a result of Israeli withdrawal, suddenly you would have more terror attacks from more angles, coming in, and as this would be, of course, obviously problematic. Now, Israel's withdrawal isn't a sort of complete withdrawal, and instead they still exert heavy pressure on the Gaza Strip by use of preventing any sort of goods flowing into the Gaza Strip. Now, keep in mind, Gaza also borders Egypt, but we have, again, the Egyptian president who was assassinated by the Islamic extremists, aka groups like Hamas. Of course, Egypt's not going to really be a huge fan of allowing people and goods to travel through there. And so what Israel does is they sort of clamp down. We have a little bit of a passage describing it. Most Gazans have been unable to leave for the past decade, trapped in what has often been described as the world's largest open-air prison. In fact, since the average age of the population is just 16 years old, many, if not most, of Gaza's inhabitants have never left the area, giving a rise to a widespread sense of claustrophobia, frustration, and despair. So, notably, there's been kind of a blockade that's been long-standing, even before the contemporary issues that are happening now. And the aim of the blockade has always been not to, prevent any sort of arms, but to instead weaken Hamas as much as possible, where a lot of civilian goods are not allowed through. There's a passage I think is important to kind of note here as well regarding Hamas's strategy, which is not just entirely, it's often painted in a particular light as just being pure savagery, but often the violence is instrumental, albeit without any sort of care for Israeli life or anything like this, but is often meant to achieve a specific strategic end. And to read this here, Hamas itself claims that the rocket attacks are aimed at forcing Israel to end its blockade of Gaza. But the strategy is not quite as simple as that. Its rocket attacks have actually been intended to provoke Israeli military retaliation against Gaza, which Hamas has hoped will then draw more international attention to Gaza and lead to diplomatic pressure on Israel to make concessions or change its policies, while alleviating pressure on Hamas to make political or ideological concessions. Second, they have also used it to retaliate against Israel when the IDF assassinates Hamas leaders. But the important one is they are trying to draw international attention to force Israel to make concessions, while Israel is trying to undermine their own legitimacy by making conditions as bad as possible for the people in the Gaza Strip, without completely, starving them out, such that, Hamas is undermined. And so you have this dual track kind of exchange, which is just absolutely terrible for the people inside of the Gaza Strip, where both sides are effectively sacrificing the civilian population there to achieve, ends that are political, but not political in like the contemporary or like the common usage of political, but instead having to do with what exactly will happen, in regards to Hamas here, whose aims, of course, are, the creation of a Palestinian state and explicitly like the annexation of all of Israel, at least in their charter. There's a couple more passages I wanted to read here. The fact that Hamas still controls Gaza isn't actually an outcome that suits Israel. Its offensive against Hamas, which are described in the book, but we're not going to get into, 2008 to 2009, 2012, and 2014, were not intended to destroy the group or dislodge it from power, although some Israeli cabinet members have advocated for these goals. Israel wanted to deter Hamas and weaken it, but not weaken it so much that Hamas would be unable to maintain control over Gaza. Israel does not want to reoccupy and rule Gaza. And so here we have, for the same reasons they wanted to leave it initially. Obviously now it looks a bit different, but also we have here human rights groups and the UN Humanitarian Rights Council have accused the IDF of committing war crimes in Gaza, while Israeli officials blame Hamas for launching rockets from densely populated urban areas, storing weapons at schools, and tending to use civilians as human shields. In the eyes of many people around the world, Israel appears to be most culpable, if for no other reason than the hugely lopsided casualties from these wars. And I'd like to emphasize that last part. If for no other reason than the hugely lopsided casualty ratios of these wars. To kind of borrow a little bit of a pun, I guess, in a sort of David and Goliath story, it seems that whichever side is just significantly weaker, which of course is Hamas, tends to generate a sort of sympathy, which, when you're thinking through things, I think you have to be leery or aware that, you might have a sort of bias towards having sympathy for the side that is weaker, or empathy, or whatever the word is, but at the same time, not trying to argue that Israel's like a good actor here, but that is a striking point that I thought would be worth highlighting. So the conclusion is also titled The Long Path to Peace, and in it, three things are primarily discussed. We're going to highlight two. It discusses two-state solutions, why they do or don't work. It discusses one-state solutions. We're not going to get into that. And finally, it offers a third solution. Now, on the two-state solution, there was a couple passages I thought were particularly striking and indicative of just how much progress is necessary to be made. I think that, and this is what the author thinks, or seems to highlight, that community solutions that involve bringing Israelis and Palestinians closer in contact such that there is actually a social intermingling will be necessary for peace. But to kind of read this off now, what I'm about to read kind of gives you a bit of an indication that peace at this juncture is not really, possible, despite to whatever degree people are going to outcry for it. So here we have it. There's even less public support on both sides for what it might actually take to achieve a two-state solution. In a survey taken in 2018, for instance, just 37% of Palestinians and 39% of Israeli Jews, so this is less than a majority, supported a two-state solution that consisted of a demilitarized Palestinian state, an Israeli withdrawal to the Green Line with equal land swaps, the resettling of 100,000 Palestinian refugees in Israel under the rubric of family reunification, and a division of Jerusalem and with West Jerusalem and the capital of Israel and East Jerusalem, and with West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine. So this is the deal that seems to be kind of, splitting the difference as equally as possible, and still less than 40% on both sides support this deal. On both sides. So it's not just, it's a bit of bad faith to just say, both sides are willing to come to the peace table and accept something, when you kind of split what it looks like. It's not it. A lot of, it's not a concession. Both sides don't want to make concessions. Later, the survey did, however, find that many of those who opposed a peace agreement on these terms would change their mind and support it if given certain concessions. So, the problem is not peace in theory, it's just the level of concessions. Even later, a sizable minority, roughly a third, on both sides can be accepted to reject any agreement involving a territorial compromise. So what do you do? On both sides, the most dogmatic of these rejectionists are religious extremists, specifically hardline religious Zionists and Palestinian Islamists who sanctify the land and claim the possession of it, under a religious sort of term. And so this is like why a two-state solution doesn't necessarily look good. And without going into too much detail, the author does propose a solution that I found very, very fascinating, and that is the idea of a confederation. And so what this would involve is kind of turning into a two-state type of solution, or two-state plus, where you have, freedom of movement and economic linking, similar to the European Union, and you allow people, to live in either Palestine or Israel, while maintaining their citizenship in their other country. And so you delink citizenship from residency to alleviate one of the chief Israeli concerns, and you would also need to have, various other things going on, like, for example, demilitarization of Palestine definitely makes sense from the Israeli perspective. It is, of course, not one Hamas, for example, they discuss this in the book, would be willing to concede to unless all Palestinians vote for that sort of agreement, which would include all of the Palestinians in exile, which would be a difficult vote to cast. And so, it is difficult to think for that to work, but I think that is an interesting solution that the author proposed. But there we have it. That is kind of a summary of what went down in this book. Okay, so now we kind of have, a return to our more usual format here. By the way, if people enjoyed the format with, the images and kind of the long-form summary, it was quite a bit more effort to do that. But if people enjoyed it, please leave some sort of feedback. But moving on into kind of my explanation of why I wanted to read this book, it was largely for okay, I guess it's maybe three reasons here. The first reason is, of course, what's going on between Israel and Hamas makes me want to know more about it, because if I'm going to talk about something, I think it's important to know about it, and I think that, at the very least, reading a single book about a topic, I think, is an important, if you are going to spend a solid amount of time talking about something, because a book only takes 10 to 15 hours to read, even if you're annotating it, or I guess it depends on how fast you read, but this is something where if you're going to spend 10 hours discussing something, you should probably spend 10 hours reading something, because often there's a whole lot of more nuance that can be appreciated. And okay, the second reason is I actually think a lot of the contemporary information on what's going on between Israel and Palestine, differentiating them from Hamas, it is just not very useful, and it's not very good. And I think a lot of the contemporary information between Israel and Hamas is also not very useful. I think it's highly politicized, and by highly politicized, I mean not only does each side have an agenda in particular that they want to push, but also that it's, the Israeli government and Hamas are both incentivized to lie about casualties, for example. So anytime you hear a report on casualties, you have to take it with a grain of salt. And this remains true for most pieces of information, because they're currently engaged in an armed conflict, and having an advantage, an informational advantage there, is much more important than communicating accurate things to the public. and it's not even close. And so I'm not expecting a lot of the contemporary information to be necessarily that reliable, so I don't want to consume a bunch of contemporary stuff as it relates to like right now, and also a lot of stuff right now is just completely devoid of context, and it's like reactionary types of information, which like kind of brings into the third reason I wanted to read this. Is this covers the entire like background situation from 82 basically, with the assassination of Tsar Alexander, I think it was his name, up till like 2018, which was like the publish of the book, or 2019, and it provides all like kind of the background context. And I think the background context is more important than like reacting to like recent events or like skewed perspectives on various things, because I think that this allows for nuance, and the nuance is important. Like there's a lot of, I think, distinctions that I made in the book, and maybe I should have made a list of them, that I think were really important for like understanding it, which is that this is a complicated issue. It's not straightforward, and I think anyone who's and by issue I mean between Israel and Palestine, not between Israel and Hamas. I think that is still complicated, but not as complicated. And I think that lacking a sort of nuanced view of things, I thought the author was very balanced. He certainly made neither side look particularly good, and also provided a lot of context, which is like one of the biggest pieces of context is like kind of what we had at the very end there, where like over 30 or less than 40% of both sides would support a solution. So like, what are you gonna do? Like exactly, like also Palestinian leaders assassinated the leader of Egypt for negotiating, and then Israeli extremists assassinated the Israeli leader for negotiating. And so like it's not necessary, like not only do you have like you have to consider what's like just, and like what solution is fair, and like this type of thing as a consideration, and also consider the security of your country. The fact that leaving the Gaza Strip created this vacuum which Hamas emerged from is obviously like a consideration. But not only do you have to like think about this, but like what might be the proper solution might just not be easy to implement. Like the portions of the books that talked about the Israeli settlers, that they occupy a large percentage of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. And so, for example, you could have a military coup if you just unilaterally withdrew from the West Bank, for example, although they would unilaterally withdrew from Gaza without having a problem, but West Bank is considered religious land. But like, secondly, like there's a lot of like settlers there who are violent towards the Palestinians at this current juncture. And if you tried to tell them they had to leave, and they thought it was you have both sides has sizable populations, roughly a third, that is not going to be amenable to any sort of territorial concession, any whatsoever. So like you have the UN charters, like you have that they want the Palestinians want the original UN agreement in 47 that they said no to, which is like I don't know what it would be fair. I don't even know how to possibly analyze that, but I know that the compromise that is the most in between the two of them achieves less than 40% support, and the a third of each side is just hard no. That is the Palestinians and the Israelis. Okay, let's get into the ratings. So for utility, I give it a 7.5. This is largely because I think it's useful for understanding something that's going on pretty contemporarily, and this utility is contingent upon, it's probably just useful to read within the next however long this conflict's going to go for. After that, maybe it drops to like a 6 or a 5.5, but this is like a major political issue, so I think having an understanding of it, if you have any sort of, you navigate it all through like international political considerations, is probably good. And I'm just a huge fan of What Everyone Needs to Know series. It's put out by Oxford University Press, and I generally think it's pretty good. For novelty, I give it a 7. I think that there's a lot of bad information regarding and heavily biased information. This seemed to be quite a bit balanced and presented stuff in a more matter-of-fact way rather than condemnation. So I gave it a 7. I think that also understanding the underlying what's going on is more important than consuming like shock information, like seeing like children like just absolutely brutalized, which is what's been going on the past few weeks, is not like informative. It's like it pulls on your outrage strings, but it's not information dense like type of content. And so I think it's useful to consume something that's information dense. For entertainment, I gave it a 4. It's not very entertaining, but it's also not like this enormous slog, so like okay. For style, I give it a 5.5. I was gonna give it a 6. Very, very readable, but there's like something that the author does that I absolutely hate stylistically, which is starting sentences with indeed. I just hate it. Like, it just drives me mad. I think it's like there's no indeed comma sentence that cannot be like that is like reliant on indeed. I'm not a fan of that. But otherwise, it's very easy to read, and so that's why there's kind of a little bit of a gap between readability and style. Generally, these are highly readable. The format of these is, very simple question, very straightforward answer. So, why has Israel built a long barrier in the West Bank, for example? And then you have the answer. And so, even the table of contents has it like just question and answer format. Hopefully that can focus up a little bit, but I find the format very accessible, and also one where you could pick and choose what you want to read about. For example, like if you want to read about just the wars, or if you want to read about just the beginnings and like this type of thing, it's something that's easy to do, easy to parse through, and so it's very, very readable. And for interest, I gave it a 7. I think there was a lot of distinctions that I thought were particularly interesting and striking, and added a whole level of nuance that I had not seen kind of really with any sort of media that's been put out on this subject. So I was very delighted to see it. Like, you get like an example of which is like a lot of people are talking about a ceasefire, and like if you have a ceasefire, like what will happen right now, to preserve Palestinian life, which I'd want to reduce human suffering, right? But if you have a ceasefire at this juncture, like at the recording of this, on October 31st, shout out to not going out for Halloween, what it will look like, it'll look like a victory for Hamas. If you have like an immediate withdrawal from the West Bank, for example, it will look like a victory for Hamas. It will promote the types of behavior like the attack on October 7th. And so I'm not suggesting I have like the solutions, but I think that this book, like one of the striking things is like how Israel not unilaterally withdrawing from Gaza being somehow a mistake, because they didn't negotiate with the power that would be more peace oriented. This instead gave political power to Hamas to undermine the other group. And so this was fascinating, and it like really contextualizes how stuff is not super, super straightforward. And so I thought that was interesting, and so this is why we gave it an interest of 7. There was a lot of like aha or oh type of things reading through it. Which, to be fair, these are aha and oh in the context of me, also receiving a bunch of other information. And so, like, the broader context of receiving information on this conflict between Israel and Hamas is, of course, making this book more interesting. Anyways, overall of 6.33. As far as recommendations go, pretty much anyone who wants to get a bit of a background on the Israel-Palestinian conflict, which I think is incredibly useful right now for the purpose of, understanding better. I really am just a huge fan of the editorial oversight of What You Need to Know series. A lot of times I've checked the sources and this type of thing, and like the editors seem pretty strong. It seems to be very information dense without being at all. The series in general seems to be very information dense without being particularly narrative or the bias driven or this type of thing, which I think is important for a topic such as this. And so even if you're not interested in this conflict specifically, would just generally recommend the series. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed. If you enjoyed the format, which was much more longer form and took a lot longer to do, please feel free, or please let me know, because I would like to know that, because it did take quite a bit of time. In theory, I could be reading more books instead of, editing and recording and like this type of thing, and so that's a consideration for me. And I think I said do the YouTube algo stuff, so I guess it's now time to say have a good day. See you later.